My name is Anthony. I'm the pastor of Dot Church. And tonight we're going to talk about another big issue within the church in America. I was talking to a friend the other day about the people who are kind of in that phase of deconstruction. And many of you on this call might consider yourself in that camp. And I was saying that if Christians deconstruct for, say, like 10 reasons, maybe 8 of them are things that have been added on top of authentic Christianity that need to just be removed altogether. Things like racism or sexism. When we find them in the church, they just need to be purged. The other 2 out of that 10 might be issues where they think there's only one option and they just can't get behind it. Like maybe you were taught that you need to believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And if you don't believe that, you can't be a Christian. Or maybe you've heard that women must submit to men in any situation and they can't preach or be pastors. And in those cases, we can come together and from a place of like, hey, there's other Christians who don't agree with that specific theological interpretation. You might have been taught that this is the only way to interpret those passages, but other Christians, they've read them differently over the past 2,000 years. But tonight, we're going to talk about one of the reasons from that first 8. This is something that, in my opinion, is just completely wrong with the church in America, and it needs to be gotten rid of altogether. There's not like a redeeming version of this, or that this is just a different theology or something, because we're going to be talking about toxic church cultures. And we're going to be specifically looking at how some leaders take the church and pervert it into something that doesn't bring spiritual flourishing, but actually brings spiritual death. But I want to be clear, it's not only the leaders of these churches who perpetuate toxic cultures. People who spend time in these churches end up being formed by the culture and then can sometimes unintentionally adopt many of the toxic attitudes themselves. And then they can end up reinforcing that toxic culture, whether they want to or not. But I have always been of the belief that the toxicity and the corruption always has to start at the top, and that the leaders themselves are those who are the most culpable. So many people who are deconstructing their faith, they look at the leaders of churches, and in many cases, especially in the very large churches, they don't find people who look like Jesus really at all. They find people who look more like your run-of-the-mill celebrity. Pastors with $1 million homes, pastors with these massive platforms, pastors going on massive book tours, having VIP section in their churches that they keep for when celebrities visit. How many of you, put it in the chat, how many of you have seen the Instagram account called Preachers and Sneakers? Has anyone seen that? Put that in the chat if you've seen that. Preachers and Sneakers. It's basically just pictures of pastors while they're preaching, and then the guy who runs it, he puts a picture next to it of how much their shoes cost. And these pastors will be wearing like $2,000, $3,000 shoes, or like a belt that's like, $3,000. And this account, it blew up because it highlights the blatant hypocrisy. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think it's necessarily sinful for a pastor to make a good living from their job. But in so many of these cases, it seems like such a far cry from what Jesus talks about in that passage that you just heard Annie read. Jesus literally says those who exalt themselves will be humbled. But the main problem, it's not even that these pastors make a lot of money. You could make the argument that pastors of very large churches should make a lot of money. I would probably disagree with you, but I think you could make that argument. The real problem is that these pastors, they routinely create or at least perpetuate extremely toxic church culture. It's not that they just have a huge house. They've also built a huge culture where they can do no wrong. A culture where other staff members not only let their personal failures slide, but in many cases, they'll do everything to protect these pastors from being held accountable. And while not every pastor gets famous enough to make millions of dollars, all senior pastors have the ability to build up these same toxic systems, even if their churches are small. There was a recent article in Christianity Today by Rich Viotis that was titled, The Celebrity Pastor Problem is Every Church's Struggle. When we see headline after headline about very prominent pastors who fall into these scandals, whether they're financial, sexual, or sometimes both, and a combination of other things as well, we have to ask, is this just a case of a few bad apples, or is the orchard itself spoiled? A lot of people see all of this going on and they say, I don't know if I can be a Christian anymore because of this. Maybe they went to one of those churches, one of the large ones where the pastor fell with like a massive moral failure. I know that we have some people on the call who are actually in that exact scenario and they feel burned. If that's you, you feel burned. But I want you to know that Jesus is actually more angry about this than you are. Jesus loves his church and wants it to be a house of prayer, not a den of robbers. He wants it to be a place where broken people can receive healing, not where people can come to build a platform and take advantage of other people. Tonight, I want to ask two very specific questions. The first one is this: what makes churches become toxic? And the second question is, how can we prevent this from happening and pave a path towards forming healthy churches? And we actually have two amazing guests with us on tonight. If you saw the post on Instagram, you're probably super excited. I mean, I have been really, really excited about this conversation. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Deb, who's going to introduce them, and then we'll dive into this topic a little bit deeper.
Awesome. So joining us tonight, we have Laura Barringer. She is the co-author of a church called Tove, forming a goodness culture that resists abuses of power and promotes healing. Laura is a graduate of Wheaton College in Illinois and currently resides in the Chicago suburbs with her husband, Mark, and 3 beagles. I also found out that she is a teacher, which is crazy because I'm a teacher. I'm from Wheaton and I have owned beagles all my life. So when I found out those facts, I was a little thrown off. And also joining us is Laura's dad, Scot McKnight. Dr. Scot McKnight is a speaker, writer, professor, and equipper of the church. He is a recognized authority on the historical Jesus, early Christianity, and the New Testament. He has a very successful blog called Jesus Creed and also co-authored a church called Tove with Laura. So we are really excited and honored to have you both on tonight. I think it's going to be a massive blessing to this community. So everyone, please give them a warm welcome in the chat.
Great to see you both. Thanks so much for being on. I read the book that you guys wrote together, and I just thought it captured so acutely the problems that are like, we're seeing it everywhere in the country. Big churches, small churches. It doesn't seem like it's even limited to one specific branch of Christianity. And you two both are from Chicagoland. I grew up in the northern suburbs and I lived downtown for a while. And so the three of us, we got a front row seat to see what happened at Willow Creek, what happened at Harvest, all the big mega churches that are by us. So first of all, before we dive into the topic, what was it like writing a book, father and daughter together? And then we'll dive into some of the more serious stuff.
You're going to have to ask which one you want to answer the question, because this one is going to come.
Overall, it was very fun. My dad, I had to convince him to use Google Docs. He would prefer to email the manuscript back and forth.
That's
Google
awesome.
Google Docs is from Hades. It doesn't handle the footnotes right, so I had to learn. But I struggled to learn how to do this, and we've had arguments, just fun family arguments about who wrote what and some of the favorite expressions in the book. Like, we dedicated it for wounded resistors, and Laura is convinced that she is the one who came up with that, and I know I did.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And if someone in the chat wants to drop the link for that book, because it's definitely worth reading, and we could talk a little bit more at the end, just where's the best place to follow you and find out more about you. But I would love to just begin with the question: what makes a church toxic, in your opinion? What are some of the features that you've seen in toxic churches, maybe big and small? And maybe whichever one of you wants to start first, maybe we'll start with Scott for that one.
Okay. Toxic cultures have a culture of self-centeredness. I think that the culture of the church becomes larger than the individual pastor, and often it's a combination of the pastor. It's easy just to blame the pastor, and often it is. I mean, I know some of these mega church pastors who've created bad cultures because of their personality. But to me, the toxic culture is one in which, let's just say this, that the Tov, the goodness of God, of Jesus, doesn't come through, but the power and the celebrity nature and the narcissism and the fear, they're the ones that come through. The institution matters more than the people. So our experience in looking at these churches is that there's some pretty common characteristics, and those are at the heart of them. Is that, Anthony, it just comes down to this: they're just not very Jesus-like. You think, what is going on here? They've learned power and success are measured by the wrong things.
And Laura, were you attending Willow Creek at this point when everything went down? My sister was, her and her family, and so they kind of watched as everything unfolded with Bill Hybels. Were you, because you had to gone to that church at some point, correct?
Correct. I attended Willow Creek for 20 years. I met my husband there, and we had actually left not long before the scandal broke. I want to say it was about a year or so. We were out. So I can honestly say we did not leave because of the scandal, but we were very deeply affected and wounded by it. We felt betrayed by the leadership, not just by Bill Hybels, but by all of the individuals who covered up the truth and hurt people that we know and care about deeply. So to answer your question, no, I wasn't attending at the time, but I do have a long history at Willow Creek.
And you both talk a lot about in the book with some of these churches, kind of some of the characteristics as people have looked back on, like there were some red flags, and maybe speak a little bit to those red flags. Like, what were some of the things, maybe what Scott was mentioning? How were you seeing that appear even in the Willow culture? And I know that Willow, for anyone who's familiar with Willow, they've really tried to turn things around and have done a lot of stuff to try to correct the errors of the past. But maybe give like a brief, you don't have to go into huge detail, but just around that whole idea, what happened loosely, and then what were some of the red flags that if someone had been paying close attention, they might start seeing this could be going down a bad path.
Well, Anthony, one of the things we've learned about these kinds of churches is let's just say the structure, the powers, the mega church pastor, his associates, the elders, have a unique capacity to keep other people from knowing things. There's a lot of things that happen behind closed doors. I attended Willow Creek for 10 years, and I'm a seminary professor. I think I can see some of these things because this is what I'm trained to do. This is what I look for. This is what I study. And Laura was there for 20 years. We did not see any of these issues that came out with the sexual abuse, sexual harassment. We didn't see any of it. We saw, let's say this, we saw and heard on a routine basis everything as the opposite of that. So hiding in plain sight was part of the strategy. So I think there's a masking of these issues. However, if you are in the inner circle, and if you are on the next circle, and this is how these churches build, aren't they? Don't they? You will see things. These are the people who have to call things out. They're the only ones who see them. And a lot of them who do get fired. A lot of them who try to speak up are threatened, are bullied, are paid off for silence because they need the money. So I don't know that you can sit in a congregation and look up on a platform and say, I'm seeing things. I think these people are too good at what they do.
I will say I had no inkling of any of the sexual abuse that was happening, but looking back now, I see red flags that I did not realize were red flags at the time. There's very much at Willow Creek a celebrity culture where it felt like the people on stage were famous and celebrity, for lack of a better word. And I understand now that that is not healthy for the people on stage nor for the congregation. So that I saw, but I will be honest that I did not recognize it as a red flag at the time. I think it's hard, at least in my experience, when you're in the middle of it to see it. For me, it took getting out to see the toxicity.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Man, there's so many different pieces of that would be worth diving into. I think
You're right.
I think especially when it comes to sexual sins, it's that you're right. I think they're very good at hiding. I think there are some larger churches, and you probably would agree, where the character of the pastor comes through in the preaching in these cases of where it's the person was a bully or this person was very aggressive. Some of that does come through, I feel like. Would you guys agree, like in those cases?
Yeah. I mean, I know some of these pastors who, I mean, I think we can all agree that Mark Driscoll was a bully. All right. It came through in his sermons. He's mean, he's sharp tongued, etc. You got to think, if you got any kind of human perception, you got to think he's doing more than that behind closed doors. The other side of it, though, is people are blessed. They learn, they grow, they love the church. They see people come to Christ. They hear great sermons. They learn things. It's their community. It's not an either or. And this is one of the things that I would want to share with your audience is there is no perfect church. There is no entirely Tov church. You might know some churches that are mostly toxic. You may have experienced them, but most churches are a mixed bag because humans are a mixed bag. We're a mixed bag of Tov and toxic. And when we all get together, let's just say you get 100 Tov and toxic people together, you're probably going to see more toxicity than you are Tov at times. And you just can't say that's the way it always is. So I would ask for a little bit of grace, a little bit of forgiveness, but there comes a point where you say, this just is wrong. And there's something seriously wrong when leaders are acting like this, when they don't treat people who need kindness in the proper way, when they don't show compassion, love, service, justice. That's when you got to pull the plug.
So is there a way that people in these churches, if there's someone on this call maybe who's a part of a church that maybe seems like it's leaning more toxic, at what point do you say, I can't help reform this church? I've tried, I want to be a source for good, but my efforts are not being, heeded or whatever. It's time for me to move on. Is there a way that you would counsel people to know what is the time to stay and to try to fix what's broken, and when is the time to leave?
Well, I'll let my dad answer in more detail, but I don't know if there's one right answer for everybody. I think it depends on the situation and the people and your own discernment and counsel. But I'll let my dad answer that more fully.
I think it's hard. It's going to be up to different people in different ways for different topics and different settings, et cetera. But here's one thing that I think is wise is a person needs to have someone with whom they can talk to about these things that is safe. Maybe a therapist, maybe someone on staff, maybe a friend at the church, maybe a gray-haired, bald-headed person that they know who can offer to them wisdom about this topic, about this issue, and help them see through it. I mean, some people see, they didn't get what they wanted, and therefore the church is toxic. No, that's not the case. There are people who, they're going to work till they get what they want. And if they don't get what they want, then the whole place is going up to hell, So I would say, find someone that you can talk to about it that's safe, who understands the situation, not just someone outside, but who's going to sympathize with you, but someone in close enough to say, I'm watching the same thing. I think you're overreacting, or I saw that and I have my concerns too. So I would say that's the first one. But when it is, the other side is when it is clear violation of Christian principles in a consistent or persistent way, when that person or that practice has been, let's say, has been called out and the church defends it or minimizes it or criticizes the critic, gaslights them, spins the story, that's a point when you're looking at a very toxic culture. And I would say there are people that I know who love a good fight and they want to stick it out. They want to get in and fight. And there are other people who say, fighting is not for me. I'm going to go where it's more peaceful. So individual people are going to respond in different ways over different situations. But I really believe the most important thing is to find a safe, wise person who perceives the situation even better.
Let's talk a little bit about just the idea of a celebrity pastor. Stephen in the chat, he says, didn't the early church just meet in small groups and houses? Seems like that model would be more difficult to run into those celebrity culture issues, although obviously toxicity could still happen there too. And then Simon says, yeah, the church in Acts was like that. I think there's a lot to gain from that type of community rather than the megachurch style. Do you think it's just an issue that if the pastor gets enough notoriety and becomes famous enough that the toxicity will always follow? Are like pastor and celebrity, are those kind of mutually exclusive terms, or what's your read on that?
You know, these are really big questions, Anthony, because there's been a glut of mega churches that I think the number is very high. Very few of them grow by evangelism. They just poach people from other churches who are sort of disaffected or unhappy, and they just go to another church. I think the way to put it is this: mega churches have an irresistible ability to attract mega egos. Big ego guys, these are mostly men, big ego guys like big platforms. Okay. They're good at it. They can smooth talk. They're gifted. They can preach. They can get the right people around them. They can scare people off who want to criticize them. So they end up creating power. I would say that mega churches have a distinct challenge of disciplining the ego of people. And I've been on some of these platforms. I've met some of these mega church pastors. It's an ego rush to have 20,000 people clapping for you after you said something that was rather banal. You go, really? You think that's good? I got better stuff coming, you know. But it is an ego rush. It's a temptation. I'd like to comment about the early church. The early church had small churches because there were no other options. Okay, so this isn't necessarily a great argument, but mega egos are not going to develop as much. Celebrity is not going to develop as much when the church is small and it has leadership that is spread out, power that is spread out. So we can learn a lot from those early churches that they didn't have some of these mega church problems. But let's face it, if you read the letter to the Corinthians and you read the letter to the Galatians, if you read 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, Paul's letters to those churches, there were problems. I mean, there were ego problems. There were people trying to create their own agendas. So we got humans who want to do this. They want power, and we just have to try to help form structures and characters that don't develop like that.
We had a friend read the manuscript of our book before it went to print, and he felt like, he gave us really good feedback. He felt like we were too hard on megachurches in our book. So it softened quite a bit from what it was at the start. But I think my overall takeaway from researching church abuse and toxicity was, and I learned this from my dad, is that it really takes a person of enormous character to lead a megachurch and not fall temptation to the celebrity.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah, I can't remember who said this, and if someone in the chat remembers, there was some quote I heard, but they were like, it takes a unique person to stand up in front of a group, it's big or small, and say, I'm going to speak to you the word of God. And even, if you're in front of a large group of people, it's like there's some level where it's like, how are you not going to let that affect you and somehow get to your head if you're saying, I'm proclaiming God's word
Yeah,
to
that's
all of
right.
these people.
Chuck DeGroat wrote a book called When Narcissism Comes to Church. When Laura and I had a conversation with Chuck, and he said, every pastor is on the spectrum of narcissism. Who else likes to get up in front of people and tell them what to do? Add to that you're telling them the word of God. Add to that then that you're pretty good at it. Before long, people look at you as a mediator of God. And that's not a good position to be in if you are not aware that it's the result of God's Spirit. So, there's a book by a friend of mine who wrote, What Do They Hear? When pastors read the gospel passages, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they identify with Jesus. Preachers identify with Jesus. When lay people read the same passages, they identify with the characters in the text. That is a revelation of the problem we're talking about. If you don't approach the text as a disciple, as someone in need of Jesus, you start to develop, let's call it a Messiah complex. So that's a big issue. Big issue. Good question.
I think it was Chuck, actually. I think I heard him on a podcast, and I think that was the quote that I was thinking of.
Sounds like him.
So let's shift gears a little bit. I have been accused of spending too much time hammering about the things that are wrong with the church, and not enough time saying how do we make things right, and how do we move towards reconstruction. And so my inkling may usually be to say, let's call out what's wrong, more than I say, let's point to what's right. So your book, it's two parts. The first half is talking about the toxicity in churches, but the whole second half, which I think is longer in length, is talking about how do you have a healthy, functioning church. So maybe speak to that concept of Tov, and then maybe talk a little bit about the circle. And I think there's eight pieces of the circle, but maybe just speak to some of those things that would help guide a church in resisting the toxicity and becoming a more healthy place.
I see my dad put in the chat about Tate's Creek Presbyterian Church. When we were researching for the book, I came upon this story of, it's called Tate's Creek Presbyterian Church. The pastor's name is Robert Cunningham. It's in Kentucky. And I felt, you have to understand, we had just come out of the Willow Creek tragedy, and we're kind of in the midst of it, trying to uncover what was the truth, what was not. And I read this story about this pastor in Kentucky who had accusations, not against him, but against somebody else in the church. And the way that he handled it is everything that you were just asking. What does a Tov, a culture of goodness, look like? He is an example of it. We wrote about him in the book, and we have his story posted on our website. It's churchcalledtov.org. You can read more about it there. But essentially, he apologized to the victims first. He apologized to the church community. He apologized to the families. He apologized to the whole town of Lexington, Kentucky. He said, we are surrendering to the process. We are opening our books. We're hiring an investigative outside company. We want to know the truth. We're going to search for it. And then we're going to make it known to whoever wants it known. And it was such an example to me of humility and goodness and truth. And I felt a little emotional reading it, because I thought, what could Willow Creek have been, for those of you who know the story, had they submitted themselves with humility the way that this church did in Kentucky. So there are examples of goodness. And Dad, do you want to talk about the circle?
Yeah, yes. There are a lot of examples of Tove people in Tove churches. But to me, Anthony, here's what I say. We need character. We need to look for character in leaders, in pastors, but in Christians. We focus on success measured by attendance, measured by buildings, measured by money, measured by baptisms. We look for this is how we measure success. We need to start focusing on character, Tove. So what we did is we looked at the characteristics of toxicity and resisted them in a sense with characters of Tove. What are the characters? And someone who has the character of Tove resists toxicity because they know what Tove is and they resist it. So I always say it this way to my students: your church deserves Mr. Rogers as its pastor. Right? And my students all watched Mr. Rogers. So they go, yes, that's right. That's what we're talking about. A person of character who emulates the way of Jesus in whatever they do. So we focused on empathy because narcissists have no empathy for others. They have no self-insight. They're grandiose, etc. We want churches to focus on grace, understand what grace is, the power of grace, the transforming power of grace, that they can become agents of grace to other people, that they need to put people first, learn people's names, learn their stories, learn their family names. You're not a part of a church until your story is a part of the church's story. That's, this is what we're talking. Tell the truth. When something happens, tell the truth. Don't lie, don't spin, don't gaslight people, don't pay them off not to talk. We know a person who was offered 7 figures not to tell her story about what she saw. All right. Nurture justice. Do the right thing at the right time. And I'm big on this because I know a lot of pastors want to become successful. They want to become the next whoever, they don't ever say, I want to be the next Mr. Rogers. They want to be the next big church pastor. And I tell those kinds of students all the time, you need to practice humility by serving in a way, the homeless, in prisons, whatever it is, and don't tell anybody but your spouse. Don't use it as a sermon illustration because people will then be clapping for you and giving you glory for denying glory. Then it's completely backward. And the big picture for us is we want people to focus on being like Jesus, to be Christ-like. And I really believe that there are a lot of churches like this in the world. No church is perfect. No church is probably perfectly or obsessively toxic either. But we need to start seeing and working on nurturing what is Tove about churches and letting that become the preeminent thing that we focus on in church. That we had 11 people this week who were able to serve their neighbors. All right. We know a man who, when he was walking downtown, he saw an old man that had fallen down and he helped that man get up. These are the stories we tell. If you tell these stories all the time, people say, that's the kind of people I want to be like.
I love that picture of Mr. Rogers as your pastor, because I think there's something to it too, that the pastor is seen as the CEO or the visionary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a very different, you could argue a shepherd is leading the flock, but it's not the same as building a multinational corporation, right? From what we know about shepherds, they were not the prized people in society who everyone said, they're leading the companies in Silicon Valley, and we want to have one of those, leading our church. There's a good question that came in from Emma. She says, how can you be effective in bringing light bringing to light or changing culture from the inside, from being on staff at a church. Is it possible? What would be your thoughts or counsel to that?
I didn't quite understand. Is she on staff?
Yes. So saying
Yeah.
being on staff in a church, what can you do to help that happen?
Okay. I can answer this, and Laura can answer as well. But I would say, first of all, Emma, be Tov yourself, and be Tov with the people around you. And let's say nurture Tovness with others in your circle so that you can become a pocket of Tov inside that church. And that can be very influential. It's when you're not in the inner circle, when you're not on staff, when you're not a pastor, that it's harder to change the culture, because that's an inner circle that you may not have access to. But I would say focus on being Tov and surrounding yourself with being Tov, with Tov people, and working together to be Tov and try to influence in that way. It can make a difference. I mean, we'll go back to Mr. Rogers. Everybody who worked with Mr. Rogers became a better person because they worked with a man who was a good person. He was Tov. So many people never used the word Tov, but many people said he was a good man. When you're with good people, you tend to be gooder.
Laura, what are your thoughts on that as well?
Well, that was really great. I don't want to follow that and ruin it. Well, I was thinking being on staff is really difficult. In my experience, there's a lot of pressure from the organization. If you've seen something toxic, they want to silence it to protect the image. So, Emma, I applaud you for seeing it, because it's hard to see, or be that you're able to see it means that your eyes are open and you're looking.
Yeah,
I think many are blinded. So I'm really proud of you, Emma, for seeing it. We call those resistors in our book. The resistors are the ones that we really wrote the book for. So I don't have any advice beyond what my dad said, but just know that it's hard. That's a really difficult position to be in, especially when you're on staff.
We got another good question from Vince. He says, do you think we'll always have the megachurch pastor scandals, or is there hope for a new trend? I thought the pandemic would knock down some of the kingdoms, but apparently not.
I wish I was a prophet, and I'm not the son of a prophet to be able to predict. But I think that the scandals are going to knock the wind out of some people's sails. I believe that the recent books, and I'll include our book in this group because we're a part of the discussion, Diane Langberg on power abuse, and our book, and Wade Mullen's book, It's Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, or something like that. Something's Not Right.
Something's Not Right.
Yeah. And then Rachel Den Hollander and her book. These books are giving people terms, language, categories. The number of people who've written to us and said, wow, you gave me language for what I was experiencing, and it's helped me understand what's happening. When a lot of people become aware of, let's say, the marks of narcissism, or the marks of a power through fear culture, when they start to see institution creep, and they have categories, and especially when they see how churches construct false narratives to protect their own reputation, and they have language like gaslighting, silencing, suppressing, making the perpetrator the victim. When they start seeing this and they start using it, things start happening. So I think we're seeing a trend toward churches becoming more aware of toxic cultures. So I think there's going to be some knockdown that way. But we have a lot of ego-driven leaders in the United States who love the glory of success measured by numbers. And I think this is going to be with us. And I'm just hoping that there's a counter movement of what I call the skinny jeans generation, and that they will say, we won't put up with this. We are going to form a different way of following Jesus, even if it means we meet on Thursday night at a pub.
One of my friends, my Twitter friends, who is a researcher, we've been communicating back and forth for a couple of years. He said, many of us have been waiting generations for books like these to come out. Not just our book, A Church Called Tove, but he meant Langberg and Mullen and Den Hollander, that to us, we wrote our story, but how meaningful it was meaningful to hear that for many people, it is a new day, that books like this did not exist generations ago.
Definitely. And I saw that you said there's some good resources on your guys' website of all those books.
Yes.
Beverly asks, what advice would you give to someone who's been burned by church culture and doesn't want anything to do with the institutional church? And I think she probably speaks for a good chunk of people on this call are feeling that way. I don't know if I can become a part of an institutional church again.
Well, the first thing I would say is, Beverly, I'm sorry. You're not alone. There's a lot of people like this. And I don't blame you for not wanting to be a part of the institutional church. So that I would say, okay, I'm sorry that this has happened. But the other thing I would say is, don't let yourself get too far from fellow followers of Jesus. Find some friends who love Jesus, who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the way of Jesus in this world, and form relationships like this that you can trust, and go slowly and see where it takes you. I mean, it may take you to a little house church of 11 people who really are living the way of Jesus, and that's okay. I just think toxic churches destroy the confidence of people in the church, but we can't let that be the way of Jesus. That Jesus's way is healing and restoring and tov. Let's find some people who want to be like Jesus.
Well, man, that was so good. Thank you so much, both of you. We're just about out of time, but this has been so helpful. And we always tell everyone we post all these recordings on YouTube, so you can go back and re-listen. And if you want to check out those books, you can see that resource link. What's the best place for people to keep in touch with you, to see what you guys are up to? So is social media, is a website? What's the best landing page?
Twitter. We're both on Twitter, and our website.
A church called tove.org or something like that.
Churchcalledtove.org.
Yeah. Hey, Anthony, I know what notifications are on Twitter, so I'm totally hip. But I have a Twitter account and Facebook, and I have a Substack account called Tove Unleashed. So we're out there. I think you Google our names, you can find us.